Hello, this is a video about carbon-14 dating. Let me share my screen. Okay, I decided to make this video because the topic has come up in discussions with a number of different people over some period of time. And from the from a Christian creationist perspective, some individuals had been concerned that this was a problem for Christians, but really it's not. And I think it's consistent with what the Bible says. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. So I wanted to describe how carbon-14 dating works and how it's really a friend for young earth creationists. Carbon-14 dating is also called radiocarbon dating or just plain old carbon dating. And it's a method for dating things that are less than about 50,000 years old. You cannot use carbon-14 dating to go to date anything that goes to millions or billions of years. So, and an evolutionist will agree with that if he's informed. Carbon-14 dating is used for dating young things. I mean young in terms of less than 50,000 years. And it's a friend to young earth creation, and I'll explain why. First, let's review a little bit of high school science. You might remember a chart something like this where you have the carbon cycle. You've got carbon in the atmosphere, mostly in the form of carbon dioxide, and lots of things emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But plants take it out of the atmosphere. Plants feed on carbon dioxide. And so the plants have it, and then if an animal eats a plant like we do, then we get that carbon in us. And anything that's got carbon really kind of works through a cycle. And so you have carbon throughout everything that's living. All living organisms are carbon-based. And this is our friendly periodic table, which you also may remember from high school. And the key part there is carbon. Carbon is normally called carbon-12 because the atomic number is 12. It has six protons, and six protons is what makes it carbon. Now, right next to it is nitrogen with 7 protons. Nitrogen is nitrogen 14. So if nitrogen is 14, how do we get carbon-14? Well, cosmic radiation from the sun sometimes causes a nitrogen to lose a proton and capture a neutron instead. And so then you've got an unbalanced number of protons and neutrons, still got 6 protons. So it's carbon, but it's carbon-14, radioactive carbon. So this process, creating carbon-14, it happens in the atmosphere. And all the carbon in the atmosphere will have a little bit of carbon-14. And since it's in the atmosphere, it then gets into plants and everything else that uses carbon. And everything in the biosphere, due to the carbon cycle, has carbon-14 in it. But the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 is extremely small. It's only 1 part per trillion. So you in your body right now have got carbon-14 atoms, but only 1 per trillion compared to carbon-12, an extremely small number. But after something dies, it stops taking in the carbon. And so the carbon-14 in it, the poor old carbon-14, it knows it doesn't belong. And so it eventually decays to form nitrogen-14. So it goes back to what it was. And the rate at which it happens is with a half-life, and the half-life is 5,730 years. Lots of things in nature decay with a half-life. All radioactive dating methods also use a half-life. What this means is after 5,730 years, the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 is 1 part per 2 trillion instead of 1 part per 1 trillion. And then after 10,000 years, it halves again. So it's now only 1 part per 4 trillion. But remember, we're talking about extremely small numbers to begin with, and they're just getting smaller and smaller. And after you get over about 50,000 years, the amount of carbon-14 in there is too scarce to detect. So something would be essentially carbon dead. It wouldn't have any carbon-14 at all in it. So that's really a brief, really brief and simple primer of how carbon-14 decays to the nitrogen-14. And you can use this method to date how long something has been dead. So let's talk about something that's been dead longer than 50,000 years. The going prevailing idea in the evolutionary uh, background is that something like dinosaurs became extinct about 65 to 70 million years ago. Dinosaurs were carbon-based organisms, so they're full of carbon. So you could date a dinosaur bone, and you would expect that since it was 70 million years ago, that it would be carbon dead, that it would have no carbon-14 at all. So what do we find? Well, let's ask ChatGPT. So this is a conversation I had with ChatGPT. Has carbon-14 been found in dinosaur bones? Answer, yes. Tests have reported measurable amounts of carbon-14 in some dinosaur bones. Here's the picture. Why this is surprising. Dinosaur fossils are thought to be tens of billions of years old. Since the half-life of carbon-14 is only 5,730 years, any original carbon-14 should have decayed to undetectable levels within about 50 to 100,000 years. So under conventional expectations, dinosaur bones should contain no measurable carbon-14. But what's been found? Several independent researchers, including both mainstream labs and creationist groups, have reported detecting small but significant levels of carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. Here is an example of a table showing one list of cases where they've dated dinosaur bones using carbon-14 dating. And if you look at that, the numbers in red are the ages in years before present. Now, nobody is going to be satisfied with those numbers. For evolutionists, they're way too young. By a factor of over 1,000, they're way too young. For creationists, young Earth creationists tend to not think that the Earth, that they believe the Earth is some thousands of years old, but they wouldn't go out to this distance. They wouldn't go out to 25, 30,000 years. We would usually work with a younger number than that. So nobody is totally happy with that. But let's set aside the young Earth issue for a second and just focus on what the problem is for an evolutionist. The problem is these are a whole bunch of different specimens, and they all show numbers that are far younger by a factor of over 1,000. They're far younger than they should be. There should be no carbon-14 at all, but there's always carbon-14. In fact, every kind of carbon that we have still contains some carbon-14. Coal, pictured on the right, things like oil and petroleum deposits. To me, that's not quite so convincing because oil flows. But even in a diamond, we've tested diamonds and they have carbon-14. So here's another ChatGPT conversation. Is there any fossilized carbon in any form where carbon-14 is not found? And says that's an excellent subtle question. In practice, nearly all fossil carbon samples tested, coal, oil, natural gas, limestone, graphite, fossil bone, shell, and even diamonds, tend to show at least trace levels of carbon-14. Expected result says for material older than 100,000 years, all original carbon-14 should have decayed. So the true carbon-14 level should be 0. Observe result. Almost always detects some carbon-14, even in materials assumed to be millions or billions of years old. So You probably need to lean into this pretty hard if you're a creationist. You expect to get no carbon-14. In practice, you always get carbon-14. Now, you would think surely the evolutionists would have an explanation, and they do. And basically, this is it: contamination. Contamination is a legitimate thing. Obviously, if you were trying to handle a dinosaur bone and you had bacon grease on your hands or something like that, and then tried to carbon test it, there's no telling what you could come up with. And so contamination is always a consideration. You probably wouldn't want to try carbon testing a bone found at the bottom of a flowing river or something, because there's no telling how much could have got in and out of it if it was flowing in water. So you do have to be concerned about contamination. So, they say there could be laboratory contamination. There might have been something in the lab. That's your scientist with bacon grease. Or environmental contamination, like a fossil got something in it. But about this time, you ought to maybe be a little bit skeptical about, there's four answers there, but you probably ought to be skeptical about those explanations. They're whining a little bit. Is there always contamination, really? Also, that number 4 says these instruments have a practical detection floor, but the floor is not the numbers I showed you a minute ago on dinosaur bones. The floor is not 25 to 30,000 years. They're better than that. So why do we find carbon-14 in everything? Occam's razor, which usually says the simplest explanation is most likely to be correct, and Occam's razor says everything is younger than 50,000 years. That's the simple answer. It's not always, Occam's razor does not always hold, but usually it does. So here's another question we need to come back to. Those numbers on the dinosaur bones with 30,000 year age, that's too old generally for young Earth creationists. So although those dates are much too young for evolution, are they not also too old for young Earth creation? Well, they are, though the difference is far less than it is from the evolutionists, but there is an explanation. Let's go back to the picture of how carbon-14 is formed. Carbon-14 is formed by radiation from the sun. What if the world was created with no carbon-14? It's a radioactive byproduct. It's not the normal, natural kind of carbon-14. Let's just assume that there was none. Then when Adam died, what would have happened? His bones would have been carbon dated as being more than 50,000 years old, or essentially infinite age. Well, that obviously isn't true. It's showing a false age being older than he really was. Now, many creationists believe that a pre-flood world had a stronger magnetic field and also perhaps some differences in the atmosphere's composition. That would, aside from the fact that the Earth may have been created with no carbon-14, that also would have tended to shield some of the sun's cosmic radiation. And if that happened, then there would be less carbon-14 in the atmosphere. If there was less carbon-14 in the atmosphere, then everything would date much older than it really was. Now, it doesn't do that anymore, but what that means is that there used to be less, but now there's kind of a stable amount that's reached equilibrium. Now, let me give you my personal impression on this. I think that other scientists might want to study this more closely and might could give a more seasoned answer. But my impression has been that carbon-14 dates seem to be pretty reliable, back to about 1000 BC. So for around about 3,000 years, they seem to be doing pretty well. And that implies that the concentration of carbon-14 in the atmosphere has been mostly stable for that period of time, for about 3,000 years. Before that, to me, the dating gets really sketchy. And so that would imply that maybe the concentration of carbon-14 in the atmosphere was different before them. Different in terms of being less. That would actually be a healthier atmosphere. If we knew the concentration of carbon-14 at earlier dates, we could do some sort of calibration of the older dates to something more accurate. That would be a project for somebody to undertake. So, in conclusion, the presence of carbon-14 in all kinds of carbon deposits, including those thought to be ancient, argues for a young Earth. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands.